right? So let's go to scriptures explain scriptures in context, okay? Because the Bible contains a unified truth, the reader may look at the Bible to interpret itself. All right? We always talk about context, okay? In other words, when a reader questions a particular passage of the scripture, other text in the scripture helps give greater clarity to that passage. Scriptures interpret scripture is in fact a fundamental pattern of biblical interpretation in all ages. And this is, of course, one of the best way to interpret scripture is by allowing the scripture, another verse or another chapter of the scripture, to explain that particular verse that you're trying to explain. All right? For instance, when you read like Matthew 24, where Christ talks about the apocalyptic events of the end time, all right, he gave a lot of example and he made references to events of Noah, made references to events of Daniel, all right, and the prophecy of Daniel as well. So that means you have to go back to the events of Noah in order for you to understand what he's saying. You have to go back to the prophecy of Daniel and study it again in order for you to understand what Christ is referring to in such kind of thing. Why? Because scriptures will interpret scripture. Remember, we talked about things like Genesis 1:1, okay, and Genesis 1-3, okay, where we talked about in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form, and darkness was upon the surface of the deep, and God said, the Spirit of the Lord moved upon the waters, and then God said, let there be light. All right. So when you read such a scripture, you might not really get what it means. That means you will need scripture to interpret scripture in such a particular passage. Okay, there are so many of them. For instance, you have things like where Adam, the scripture gave us, Moses giving us a scripture where he says Adam ate the fruit. All right. But when we come to where Paul explained this concept and where James also explained in James chapter number 1, he told us it was sin. Okay, and he told us how this sin happened. He told us it was disobedience, and he told us how this whole thing originated. When you read the book of Romans chapter 5 and you read James chapter number 1, you'll be able to see the whole concept. Why? Those scriptures explain what happened in Genesis chapter number 3 between Adam, okay, and Eve, and what Moses called the serpent, okay, which is a figure of speech, which we now later found out that is talking about Satan. Okay, because in the book of Revelation, he is called that old serpent, okay, which is the devil, the dragon, the devil. All right. So that is scriptures interpret scripture for you. Okay, because scripture interpret scripture is in fact a fundamental pattern of biblical interpretation in all ages. This doctrine style does not mean that other scholarly helps for interpretation are irrelevant. Okay, it does, however, mean that the final word for interpreting a Bible passage is the scripture itself, not a cultural, economical, political, or ideological context derived from a secondary source. For instance, where we talked about cultural, the educational background, and several things in the previous videos, okay, so all those just help to support your understanding of what you're going to derive. But ultimately, what gives you the clearer understanding is that another scripture will explain that particular verse of scripture that you're trying to understand. All right. For instance, understanding the mind and revelation of Daniel can be traced to his understanding of Jeremiah's writing. Okay. When you read the book of Daniel, where Daniel was talking about the captivity of Israel, you're able to understand this by the time you read the prophecy that Jeremiah gave concerning the captivity of how Israel were going to be captives for 70 years and what made Daniel to do what he did. And then that even led for the prophecies to come out that led to the prophecy that spoke about the end time of the world, including the coming of Christ as well, with perfect timelines as well. Okay, so thank God for